unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. Shadows at Noon, the South Asian 20th Century is a sweeping new book by the historian Joya Chatterji. The book tells the subcontinent story from the British Raj all the way through independence and partition to the forging of the modern nations of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. This is no ordinary history, however. Of course, there's plenty of politics. There's an in-depth discussion of citizenship, nationalism, and political leaders, both past and present. But there's equal attention paid to unconventional topics, such as food, leisure, and household dynamics. Joya Chatterji is a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, Emeritus Professor of South Asian History at the University of Cambridge, and reader in international history at the London School of Economics. To talk more about this important new work, I am pleased to welcome Joya to the podcast for the very first time. Joya, congratulations on the book, and it's such a pleasure to talk to you.
It's marvelous to be able to meet you at last, because I've listened to many of your podcasts before.
Well, thank you so much. And you know, we have a lot to discuss. And, you know, before we get into the real meat and substance of the book, let me just ask you a bit about its creation. You know, it's hard to describe this book to our listeners out there who haven't picked it up yet, because it's so rich. It's very textured. It's very layered. You know, to call it a history of South Asia seems somehow inadequate. I mean, of course, you know, it is a history work, but it's also part memoir. You have bits of social commentary. You have quite a lot of cultural commentary and cultural critique. You know, maybe we could just start out by tell us about the origins of this work. And, you know, I think the most interesting decision you've made here is to break the kind of fourth wall between the author and the reader. You know, tell us about your thinking here.
Okay, so I'll start with the fourth wall question. I mean, and then maybe fall backwards to your earlier questions. This was a strategy I decided to take up, partly because I felt that it would be hard for the reader to understand, or, you know, because South Asia appears to most people, even people who are insiders to South Asia, to be incomprehensible. And so what I wanted to do was place myself alongside them as this bug-eyed child, teenager, woman, becoming adult, growing old, still struggling with incomprehension. And that it was it is a very difficult place to understand, so I wanted to put them at ease with that sense of incomprehension. I also wanted to help them engage with the questions that little girl had about the society around her, and that those questions, to some extent, have remained my questions all my life, but I've never been able to ask them in quite this way, because other things came up the way they do. Some of the questions came up when I was teaching, and I began to notice these parallels, because we are taught to teach in such siloed ways. You teach national histories and so on, that I suddenly found myself teaching the history of Pakistan, the history of Bangladesh, and hang on, there's so much similar here. And then I began to do a bit of research on this, and so I begin to try and think of ways to bring this to the attention of people in a way that will be less threatening and less frightening than if I do it through the prism of a little girl or a, kind of silly young person so that's one. One is I do it for the reader. The other more technical aspect of it is really, I challenge the mode of writing history, which has been, it's been a dominant mode, which is, in which the story is written often by a pale white male in this tone of incredible authority, which I know, that we can never be authoritative about history because history is always contingent and partial and fragmentary and based on 100 different kinds of, that's where the texture comes in. And I wanted them to understand, I wanted certain kinds of readers to understand that I was trying to change modes of history telling, or ways of actually writing history that broke free of this authoritative style, which has been the mood for so long. So those were my very limited goals, and also I was having fun.
Well, I mean, that is sort of clear as you read it, but I think the result is that it's also quite fun for those of us who are listening or who are reading. Excuse me. Before we sort of talk about some of the themes, I want to ask you about definitions. Right? In your book, you're very clear that you are defining South Asia somewhat narrowly as Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, and their respective kind of pre-1947 avatars. Tell us a little bit about your thought process here. Obviously, there may be readers in Nepal or Sri Lanka who might ask why they're not equally represented.
Okay, I mean, this is a work. I mean, this is in its own right, quite a challenging work about orthodoxies, about this narrow part of South Asia, which is deemed to be at war with, these nations are deemed to be at eternal war with each other. So there was a story to be told about this part of South Asia. Furthermore, there was a technical issue that I wanted to look at continuities or lack of continuity before and after the Raj. I wanted to see what changed and what did not. And I am, at the end of the day, a scholar, even though I may not write like one. And I do hold that you cannot actually compare things if you do not keep both sides of the comparison held down. So I cannot compare the Raj with the South Asian region, more broadly construed, for this particular purpose, for the purpose of this particular book, with its central themes and arguments. Otherwise, I have a very expansive view of South Asia, and in it I would include not just Nepal and Sri Lanka. I would include Myanmar. I would include Afghanistan. And when I was the editor of the Journal of Modern Asian Studies, I regularly encouraged people to write and submit articles on those regions, and include them on a journal which regularly published only on India. So, and I also think of South Asia's diaspora as part of South Asia. So I don't have a narrow view of South Asia. It's just that for this particular thought experiment, I mean, it's a big fat thought, but it's a thought experiment, I had to do it this way, otherwise you couldn't do the comparison.
One of the major arguments you make in the book is that the project of citizenship and nation building is still a work in progress across South Asia. And I just want to quote something that you've written. You say, making citizens identify with their nation's self-declared character and ambition has dominated South Asian politics for the latter half of the 20th century. It remains an ongoing project, hotly contested in all three countries, since there is no unanimity about what each nation's character really is. It was ever thus. From this perspective, I wonder if, say, the rise of the BJP, the continued turmoil we observe in Pakistan, the nature of kind of one-party dominance in Bangladesh. I mean, do you look at the picture and actually see more continuity than change?
I see far more continuity in the sense that people imagine, let's just take the case of India, where I am currently located. Let's just take the case of India. People imagine that there's been a slow slide from a ideal liberal past into an era of dictatorship. Sometimes people will go speak of a matter like that. I argue that, in fact, these debates about what the nation should be like and was about have actually been part of the argument, really, since the very late 19th century. And it's not new. I actually would suggest that, but for certain events, such as the murder of Gandhi, we could have actually had a Hindu Rashtra in India in 1947. We evaded that, but because of the swings of public sentiment in the aftermath of that killing. Pakistan was less lucky because it had of its demographic issues and also the rise of the army in that context. But I think that it's very important not to be too teleological in thinking that we've gone from there, this ideal time to this bad time. Times were the nation was never in a pure state. And to search for that purity at any particular time in history is a mistake. The nation itself is a flawed concept.
I like very much how you frame that, and it sort of leads me to a question I wanted to ask you about India. At various points in the book, you talk about the conflicts in India between an emergent form of liberalism and a somewhat more parochial form of social conservatism, and you have this line early on in the book where you say that India's quote-unquote liberal politics of the early 20th century had a different accent from liberalism in the West. And I was hoping that you could unpack that different accent, as you put it, for our listeners.
Yeah, sure. I think India's intelligentsia was very much engaged with reading liberal texts from not just Britain, but from the rest of the world. But because of the language issue, they absorbed a lot of literature generated in Britain, particularly the works by John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. And in that tradition of liberalism, the idea is that a polity should be based on the ideal of the greatest good for the greatest number, which is, the notion of utilitarianism. And that is the, if you like, one of the fundaments of liberalism in Britain. In India, you don't really find Benthamite ideals. What you find is quite a pick and mix bag of things which Indians appropriated from the liberal tradition to suit their particular circumstances and concerns. So interestingly, they took up the issue of positivism, which is an interest in, the demonstration through science or rigor the the arguments surrounding certain things. So Dada Bhai Nauroji and Dutt would use this positivist technique to prove certain facts about famine or GDP right at the beginning of the century. Or they would have had really strong ideas about the rule of law, which you could understand because the rule of law is being eroded. They had strong ideas about freedom of press, which is understood in this context where the freedom of press was being denied. And so their concept of liberalism, I mean, even on compromise, which is a big deal in South Asian politics, derived directly from John Morley's On Compromise, had a different meaning in India. So they chose particular aspects of, if you like, the liberal spectrum that had valence.
Joya, just to stay on this point for a second, I was struck by your observation that you make at some point in the book that it'd be a mistake to see the era of Nehru's leadership as one in which his variant of social democratic secularism kind of triumphed above all else, right? Is it the case, do you think, that political analysts, political scientists, other observers have underplayed, for 75 years, the extent to which more conservative voices were defeated in that period of, say, 1947 to 1950? Because what it seems like you're arguing is that this defeat did not imply a disappearance. It did not imply a disavowal. Is that correct?
That's absolutely what I'm saying. And I think there are scholars who have made the argument, both in the past and in the present, and including myself. And I've drawn on different works, and I feel that some of that, there's been a sort of, given the directions in which India has gone, there's been a retrospective forgetting of that history. And since nation-making is so much about forgetting, Nehru has turned into a bit of a national hero for many liberals. And now we've come to the point where Nehru could apparently do no wrong. And Nehru never had to battle it out for the party. And Nehru actually fought for liberalism. Actually, he fought for liberalism, but he did so with real timidity, if the truth be told. And it was only in particular cases, only in Delhi itself, that he could really be seen to be taking a strong stance. He left what was happening in the provinces to the leaders of provinces themselves, and the leaders of provinces weren't too keen to implement Nehruvian ideas. So, yeah, we turned out to be not so Nehruvian after all. We liked to tell ourselves that we were. We were sold the idea we were. But I don't buy it.
Well, okay, so this leads to a very related question, right? You have a section in which you discuss partition, the formation of independent states of India and Pakistan, and you say that as partition approached, these two nations, India and Pakistan, came to resemble each other ever more closely. And at the same time, Jinnah and Nehru, two men who despised each other, also came to resemble each other all the more. Tell us a bit about how they had this convergence in terms of their resemblance to you.
Can I tell you about Jinnah and Nehru or the two states?
I would love to hear about Jinnah and Nehru, but as you like.
I'll tell you about Jinnah and Nehru because the two states is a very big
Yes, absolutely. Let's focus on them.
Yeah, let's focus on them. So Jinnah and Nehru were previously very different men. Nehru had, in terms of where they stood on matters related to the nation, Nehru had insisted since about the 1920s, the late 1920s, that the nation was the big identity to which all Indians had to bow down. Whatever their concerns about their religious, caste-based, linguistic, regional, whatever interests, fears, diversities, and so on. Nehru kind of rationalized these very often as false consciousness, forms of false consciousness, and he had a very dismissive view of any minority fears. Jinnah, on the other hand, a congressman since the 1900s, had a more sensitive feel for position of minorities, the threat perception of minorities inside an overwhelmingly dominant nation where, if you like, although the notion of a Hindu coalition is also fragile, that's how they perceived it. And Jinnah was always trying to create some sort of, for a long time, trying to create some kind of coalition that would allay the fears of minorities and lead to compromise with Hindus about many issues. But at the time of partition, when Pakistan was formed, and he was given a state made up of diverse regions, sects, communities, languages, language groups, sectarian, particularly Shia minorities, etc. His response was to turn into Nehru. And then to say, actually, there is no identity other than a Pakistani identity, and everybody will be treated as a Pakistani. We can resolve all our problems if we realize that we are all Pakistani. We're Pakistani first, second, and third. So he became politically like Nehru. He had that same kind of overarching national vision of the nation that Nehru did. And it's a very bizarre thing that happened that nobody quite has ever noticed. And I'm an avid Jinnah follower, so I just happened to pick it up.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. Let me fast forward many decades and talk about the rise of the BJP, because you discuss the rise of the BJP at the end of the 20th century during the Vajpayee-Advani era. And when you talk about the BJP's rise, post 1984, the kind of successor entity to the Jansang, you say that the BJP-led India at the end of the 20th century could be described more as despotic rather than authoritarian. And for those not so familiar with the kind of terminology, tell us a little bit about what you see as the principal distinguishing features between despotic and authoritarian.
My comment comes in a context in which there was an experience of authoritarianism, I argue, for a brief time about 18 months under Indira Gandhi, in which you have two central aspects of authoritarianism in full display. One is the complete abrogation of fundamental rights and liberties, and second, a profound centralization of the state power in the hands of the leader. All seen, all observed, and, the BJP and those groups, Janta, later Janata Party, who had observed this, happened to have been aware of the public upsurge against this in the 1977 elections, and I argue that their form of despotism emerged in the context of a knowledge of how to rule firmly, powerfully, terrifyingly, but not despotically in such a sense that you could get people to rebel in this way. So I'm trying to draw that kind of distinction because they've learned the lessons of the emergency. It's hard not to have learned the lessons of the emergency because they themselves had, some of them, many people who suffered at the emergency were not people of the RSS, of course, but some were. And so they did things a little bit differently. Their approach was more on things like demolition of temples, it was of mosques, and building temples and building Ram Shilans. The discourse was different. It was on manliness, on power, on sending nuclear missiles into the air, rockets, and developing nuclear power, and on this whole muscular Hinduism returning to the forefront, and a disrespect for law, which is displayed in the demolition of the so-called disputed structure, which I think you know which structure I'm talking about. Yeah. So there's a disrespect for the law, which suggests a shift in balance of the Constitution in the direction of the executive and centralized leadership of the executive. You don't quite have the cult following that you did have that comes later. But to be fair, Advani in the days of the Yatra did have a bit of a cult following.
Joya, we kind of talked about early on how you have a bit of first-person, really kind of memoir in this book, and I want to maybe turn to that now. When you were growing up, you and your brothers would spend the summers traveling some 30 to 40 hours from Delhi by train to arrive at a sprawling property in North Bengal in the foothills of the Eastern Himalayas. And you credit that experience with teaching you that the South Asian household was not as calm and tranquil as it may seem on the surface, but actually riven internally and gripped with a kind of series of underlying tensions. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about what you experienced, because that really informs the entire section of this book that you devote to household structure and to family dynamics.
Okay. I'll put this very briefly. I noticed growing up, and I noticed the more I grew up, that in my household, some people had a lot of power. They tended to be my grandfather, the patriarch, and my grandmother, the matriarch. Their sons, my father and his brothers. And there were some people who had very little power. And they tended to be widows, daughters-in-law in a ranked hierarchy in which the youngest daughter-in-law was the least powerless and was the most powerless. The youngest daughter-in-law was the most powerless, as well as a series of people who were in different ways servitors, poor relatives, and servants who worked for the family, all of whom had worked for the family for a very long time and who were members of the household, were taken care of and looked after by the household, and who looked after the household, but who had a very different relationship with inside the hierarchy. There was a total hierarchy, and it had its norms. The girl Chatterji children, obviously did not really belong at all, as I soon realized, because they were exported by marriage. And once they were gone, they were gone. I never saw my cousins again, because you're never allowed home. And my girl cousins again, my male cousins, of course, they were there and they were there and they were there. And this, and I could see, I mean, even my beloved aunts, I could see the ways in which they would humiliate their daughters-in-law, my Bodhis, my sisters-in-law, by sort of even just with gestures of irritation and contempt. And this went on all the time. You had to be a close observer and an inside observer to understand the extent to which these dynamics played out all day, every day, inside such households. And also to understand, just to make the point that these are not happy, clappy places. Yeah? So that's all I'm trying to say. And then, but also, then I go on to explain other things about the household, which the rest of the chapter talks about. But yeah, my simple point is that it's a big mistake to imagine that these are, full of love and affection. There's a lot of love for children. That's true. But when children stop being children, bad things happen. Depending on gender.
I want to ask you about another element of the household in a way that you devote another chapter to, which is about food, which is an important part of every household and every family. And your discussion of food is intertwined with a discussion of inequality, right? Because you write, and I just want to quote something that you've written. You say South Asians care more about, quote, whose food they eat than any other people in the world. It's a fundament of caste. Food and caste are so closely intertwined that it's hard not to talk about one without the other. Tell us a little bit about what prompted you to devote so much space to the region's kind of culinary habits.
I think in order to understand a society, and a society as unique and diverse as South Asia, that diversity is well expressed through its food, because otherwise so much is shared in regional culture that some diversities are not shared. And those are that's where you really see the difference. And I think this is the darkest chapter of the book. It's the saddest chapter of the book, because you really get to see some of the harshest playing out of caste, of tribal, the treatment and suffering of tribes, and of how poverty plays itself out among vulnerable people, particularly among vulnerable people. So, I think here, I have a rebellious streak. You will have realized that. There's this celebration in the world, certainly in the West, where I live, some of the time, most of the time, of Asian food, Indian food. It's also wonderful. But I really want to say stop. It's actually, there's a lot that you're not seeing behind this celebration, this happy, clappy story that you are missing. And you probably do need to look at it. And, you really probably do need to face caste if you're looking at South Asia. And I didn't want to write a subject about caste. I want to do it the other way around. Because caste kind of restricts it to one segment, whereas food opens it up to all manner of things. And people think they're going to be told about a feast, and then they get something else. Which is why I followed the chapter up with Bollywood and, leisure things, because I think it's such hard reading, such grim reading. I mean, I wrote that chapter during COVID, so perhaps that, also explains the timber.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the cinema point for a second very quickly, because you have an interesting chapter on cinema and you contrast Indian cinema, namely Hindi cinema, with Hollywood. But in that chapter, you start by asking the question, what did Bombay not have that Hollywood did? And then you answer that by saying, the answer can only really emerge if we drop the word Bollywood to describe Bombay cinema. From, say, the 1920s to the 1990s, 2000s, the latter, Bombay cinema, must be understood on its own terms. Tell us a little bit about why you think the Bollywood-Hollywood comparison leads us astray.
Bombay cinema was so different from Hollywood in its early eras, from the 1920s to the 1990s, that it's really hard even to begin to compare it with Bollywood. It was different in some basic respects, which I'll just quickly sketch out. I'll just quickly sketch out. First of all, it lacked funding. It lacked official status. It lacked state support, which Hollywood got because the state recognized that Hollywood was a form of state power, soft power. It was a very dispersed industry in which producers and directors shared for the profits of the film with the hall owners and the distributors of a movie, the ones who owned the reels or held the reels and turned them over to the halls. And this distribution meant that actually the persons who profited least from the success of the film were the people who made the film itself. So it was a very rickety structure, whereas in Hollywood, the big production agencies, they owned the whole structure. And so they could feed all the profits back into the movies. Next, Hollywood had no difficulty getting women to act in film roles. Bombay cinema had huge difficulty in getting women to act in movies because of social norms regarding women's behavior. And so therefore it relied heavily on women from performing families. I'm not saying that they were not great actors. They're probably some of the best actors that Bombay cinema ever had. But that was a huge constraint. There were, as in this context, there were 15 hits to one dud. 15 duds to one hit. in this situation, there were 15 hits to one dud. Now, in this situation, there were 15 duds to one hit, and that meant that banks would not lend money, and therefore they had to rely on informal money markets where the rates of borrowing are eye-watering. And this would make the whole structure even more precarious. This was not the case with Hollywood. Hollywood had adequate banking provisions. This meant it had to rely on money sharks, loan sharks, who were not pretty people to do business with. So it was in these conditions that Bombay cinema emerged. But I would also like to stress the positive qualities that Bombay cinema had that Hollywood lacked. It drew on a host of performing traditions that South Asians had enjoyed, because it didn't know exactly who was going to come to the movies. It just sort of thought, okay, we know that South Asians enjoy song and dance. We know they enjoy we know they enjoy wrestling. We know they enjoy feats of daring. We know they enjoy stunts. We know they enjoy miracle plays. We know they enjoy myths. Let's put it all together and see what we get. And bingo, you get hits. That's the classic Bombay film for you. That changes in the 90s, where you get government official recognition of the industry, and then the money situation changes. And also the film industry looks to the diaspora as its market, as a large part of its market. Right. So the themes change, dancing is less in, etc. It has to be more appealing to diasporic viewers. So then it becomes gently more like Hollywood. The songs go, or the songs are just background, more in the background than in the foreground. So it changes. But it's fabulous to watch the Bombay cinema versions, the Bombay cinema production. Because that really was unique to South Asia.
Joya, I want to end this conversation with where the book ends, which is actually on a somewhat optimistic note, despite the many warning signs flashing across the region, some of which we spoke about earlier. Specifically when it comes to relations between, India and Pakistan, two famously nuclear-armed neighbors. You have this very nice line in which you write, despite all the shouty talk about eternal enmity, all the posturing, the war talk, and the flag waving, South Asia is not the most dangerous place on the planet. We're grabbing onto, a bit of optimism here. Tell us a little bit about why you came to this assessment.
I came to this assessment because I did some research on refugee rehabilitation back in the 1940s and early 50s. And the scale of rehabilitation was such that the two countries had to work together, and they had to basically work together week after week after week after week to ensure that, things happened, refugees, got their properties or whatever it was. And this set into motion an understanding that sank in that you cannot destabilize your neighbor, because if you do, it will send across another wave of refugees across your border. And that wave of refugees might just be the unmaking of you. Original wave of refugees was bad enough, but there's this fear, and it's often there've often been flashpoints which there has been possible fear of huge migrations. Because, Bangladesh has a very large Hindu population. And Bangladesh was in Pakistan for a long time, until 1971. People seem to forget that Bangladesh had a larger minority, Pakistan had a larger minority population than India did. So how could either country actually alienate each other beyond that point? So they had to work in pragmatic ways to solve the issues while maintaining, I think the shouty talk was really part of the citizenship project. They had to make us citizens. People like me and others, we had to believe, we are Indians, and we are Indians because we are what? Indians, whatever that means. And they had to keep telling us what that meant. But they could actually fight wars with Pakistan in any place that was meaningful, that was occupied, where refugees might come. So the longest war with Pakistan was in Kargil, over a piece of uninhabited rock. Not likely to send many refugees over a rock. So, this is the reality. There's so much not war over a relationship of shouty talk. I'm just trying to draw attention to that. It's actually far more pragmatic than anyone gives credit for. And relationships are, whether it's the BJP or it's Ziaul Haq or it's where it is, however, whatever the leaning of the individual prime minister or general, they can't really change the reality. That's what I think. But then I think a lot of provocative things.
Well, that's why we're so happy to have had you as a guest this week. We've been talking to the historian Joya Chatterji. She's the author of the landmark book, Shadows at Noon, the South Asian 20th Century. William Dalrymple, writing in The Guardian, calls the book a wonderfully original, genre-defying work that is sure to become a classic. Joya, it's such a pleasure to get the chance to read you and now get the chance to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure to meet you too.
Granthamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granthamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Nithya Lab. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Isabel Villegas is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production, brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.